Hello, and welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie. I'm a senior fellow here at Bruegel, and we have a fantastic podcast today. We're going to talk about EU tech regulation and the EU's role in the world, working with the biggest and most innovative technology companies and how they are regulated and innovating and helping the economies or getting in the way of the economies wherever they are. Our speakers today are Aura Sala, who is a member of the European Parliament and has been a member of the Finnish Parliament and a member of the European Commission cabinet staff, and also was the head of Brussels relations for Facebook and Meta for a while. So has seen this from all sides. And then from Bruegel, we have Fiona Scott Morton, known to all of you who follow the Bruegel website as one of our tech experts who has written extensively on all of these issues. And you can find Fiona's work on our website and throughout her publications. Aura, you are coming back to Brussels after having a couple of different jobs. What's it been like taking office in the European Parliament, going through the commissioner hearings, really coming in at the beginning of a cycle? And while you're telling us about that, what can we expect on the field of tech regulation? There's been so much happening.
Thank you so much for having me here today. And it's great to be back in Brussels bubble after 1 year in Helsinki, cold and snowy Helsinki, as I would describe it. Yeah, indeed, it will be an interesting term because my worry is that this town is not ready for regulation, and that worries me a lot. You might remember already 10 years ago, I was speaking against copyright, famous articles 11 and 13 back in the days, not saying that publishers should not have more money, but saying that, guys, you need to know what you are regulating. You need to understand the business models of these companies that you are regulating. And one important thing is that these big, bad American tech companies cannot be regulated by the EU. They need to be regulated in their own home market if you really want to catch them, as Breton was phrasing it here in Brussels. So what happened with those famous articles that started this tsunami of regulation? Nothing. Did the publishers get more money? No, they did not. And that, I think, set the scene for this tsunami of DSA, DMA, AI Act, AI Governance Act, and Data Act, Data Governance Act, AI Act, and so on and so forth. And I really want to see these regulators who wrote these pieces of regulation one day admitting that we didn't really get nowhere with this, because the problem is that they didn't take into account of business model of these companies, that they are not EU companies. They are the ones who will decide what kind of products, services they will then offer in the EU and so on. And if someone is saying that, oh, this will give room for European companies to grow now to be big, I would heavily disagree. Go to ask Booking.com how well it's going. Them being finally a digital champion in the EU, and now they are invited to the DMA unit in the Commission, where two DGs are fighting, first of all, who has most power, and they go there to explain their business model and how we will split you. So thank you for growing to be big, and now we will split you. So this kind of ex ante regulation we see with the DMA, I don't know how this will ever work in benefit of competitiveness on our own companies in the EU. We need to remember that these American tech companies, they are big because they have home market where they could grow to be big at the global scale. And the EU is maybe their second or third or fourth important market, particularly now that we are missing to UK. So I just want to make people understand in the Brussels bubble that, first of all, the best expertise on digital and tech is not in Brussels, cannot be found in Brussels. And the second thing is that we need to start focusing on our own companies, stop passing other companies from other continents, and start focusing on our own companies, enable them to grow to be big. And the thing is that we are heavily reliant on data, metadata and traffic data coming from the US, because we don't have data economy in the EU that could enable our companies to grow here, feed our AI models and so on. And we don't have single market. We don't have capital markets that we could have enough risk capital for our growing companies. So my big wish for this new commission, and I will hold them accountable, is that stop this regulation. Please deregulate, because none of the commissioners use the word deregulation in their hearings. And also start focusing on our own companies and enabling them to grow to be big in this market.
Thank you so much for that. We're starting right in the middle as this new term is coming in, because there is such a debate right now about how to approach this issue. Fiona, you are not based in Brussels, but you have worked tirelessly to try and improve and make better this regulatory environment. Where do you think we are right now? What needs to happen next?
Well, I think it's very important to grapple with the question of, should the EU regulate US companies? I would say that it's really quite dangerous for a jurisdiction to outsource the business of regulation to another country. Let's take a product everyone's familiar with, like cars. Would Europe say, well, we're not going to regulate car safety. What we're going to do is wait for the Chinese to do that. Meanwhile, we're going to buy Chinese cars, but we're going to rely on the Chinese government to regulate the cars to make sure they're appropriately safe. And we're going to just not bother protecting our own customers, but let the Chinese government protect our own customers. I don't think anyone in Europe would think that was a very good idea. But that's how product safety is supposed to work, that you look after your own customers. You don't care where a product comes from. Is it made in Germany or China or America? The car should be safe. So we regulate to protect our home consumers. We don't wait for foreign jurisdictions to do it, because maybe the Australians would make cars differently from the Chinese, differently from the Americans. So I think that's just not the way regulation works in Europe, and it shouldn't be any different for digital platforms. We need to regulate them to make our consumers safe and keep their mental health and democracy and all the things we care about. Now, on the economic side, it's a bit the same. If we want our own consumers to have choice, and if we want our own businesses to have choice and the ability to access the platform and grow and innovate, then that platform can't exercise market power off of those business users and tell them, no, we don't want you to innovate in this direction because that's threatening to our profits. You can only innovate in this other direction. So that's why you have rules like the DMA that say, no, you can't discriminate. Business users on the platform all are allowed to do the things that they want to do. And when we look and see, has there been an impact? I think there's two separate questions about impact. One is, can Europe grow its own big digital platforms and have its own Google? I wrote a piece about that for Bruegel a while ago. I think it's really what MEP Sala said about the capital markets and the single market is really critical. You can't scale up if all you can do is sell in France. You have to be able to sell across the whole EU. So fixing the barriers that occur between member states and deepening the single market is going to be absolutely crucial. If the question is, can Europe have competitiveness in being a business user on the platform, so a Spotify or a whatever, those kinds of companies are the ones that actually are enabled to grow and keep surplus when we have something like the DMA. So the DMA allows for competition in app stores. That means that everybody doesn't have to pay 30% every time they sell something in an app store. And that's really good for businesses in Europe that are trying to innovate, thinking about what returns they're going to get, thinking about what kinds of stuff they want to invent. I think that's the argument for innovation. I'll just say one last thing, which is impact. GDPR took effect in 2018. The Irish Data Protection Authority protected Facebook up to the present day. We still do not have compliance with GDPR from Meta. That means we can't really say this law doesn't work. I mean, okay, it doesn't work. It's not doing anything. But is it telling the company to do the wrong thing? We don't know because the company's not doing it yet. And it's the same with the DMA and, for example, app stores and Apple. Apple is not allowing on rival app stores. So if you don't have compliance, it's a little difficult to say this was a bad law because we're not seeing what the effect of the law was. Now, as I said, the law is bad in the sense that it's not working. I think that GDPR was not designed well enough, and the fact that companies could flee to the jurisdiction that was going to protect them, in this case Ireland, was a flaw in that law. In the case of the DMA, it's just a matter of time. I mean, compliance has only been required since March of 2024, so you obviously need to have proper process, and it takes a little bit of time to get everyone into compliance. So I think it's too early to say the DMA isn't doing anything, much too early.
If I could maybe answer to that, you answered your own question there. In the end, GDPR has been there long enough that we see the results, and it doesn't work. Because the problem, if I may now, the thing is that you need to also understand how these laws were designed. And right then, it was not designed well enough that the companies will comply. Then it's not a good law, I would argue.
Agreed.
And the thing is, what you said at the beginning, the car example doesn't work at all. Because the EU knows cars. EU doesn't know these digital platforms. And that's the problem. You need to do better your homework and know how these business models are designed, how these technologies actually work, that you can make laws that actually work. So it's not compatible. Those examples doesn't work together because we know how cars are actually made in Europe. We are one of the best ones of making cars there. So you need to actually write laws that will then work also when they are enforced, after they have been implemented, and when we are enforcing those. Meta and Google, they have business incentives in Europe to offer good customer service. No one wants to see hate speech on these platforms, and if companies doesn't want to see hate speech on, for example, on these platforms, these companies, they don't make money. And the ultimate goal of these companies is to make money. So they have incentive of their own to make these kind of rules for these platforms and remove that kind of a content. It's not because of the DSA that this is happening. It's happening because they have business incentive to do that. TikTok, Twitter or X, they don't have. X doesn't make any money. So you can not make X compliant by these rules. I would claim that Elon Musk will never pick up that bill. So we can make these big illusions that we are on the right side of history, writing this regulation. But if it's a regulation that doesn't work in practice, what's the point of this? So when I'm not saying that we shouldn't regulate, and I'm not saying that digital platforms shouldn't be safe places, what I'm saying is that we need to first understand how these business models work, how data is processed, how they use data, what kind of a data they are using. But if I'm looking at these conversations and discussions and all these papers that we are producing in Brussels, it doesn't really understand deeply how these companies work and what do we actually need to do to enable European companies to grow big. One thing that is super problematic right now for European companies is that they are heavily reliant on data from these big tech companies because they are so far ahead with having that data. So if we actually want to create AI models here, we need to enable metadata and traffic data much more and do cross-border data economy. But what we do right now with AI Act, for example, is that it says in the AI Act that every member state should create their own regulatory sandbox. What happens here is that we will fragment this market ever more because every member state now wants to, of course, compete to have the best possible regulatory sandbox to enable their companies to grow and enable AI, use data and so on. But this doesn't help data economy in the EU. Again, I'm coming back to my argument here. How these laws are written are not beneficial for our companies, for our competitiveness, and it doesn't take into account of the business model of these big global companies.
This is so helpful, both of you, in showing how sprawling this area is. We could have separate podcasts on each of these things. I'd like to maybe separate out some of the data use and innovation sides from the hate speech and propaganda aspects. And then I'd like to come back to financing and budgets at the end, just as a little teaser for what's coming up. Also, all of you listeners at home, I would encourage you to go read Fiona's article on app stores. And we also at Bruegel have published by Bertin Martens a piece on data regulation and the way the different EU data laws don't necessarily line up with each other and may need to be reconciled. First, though, let's look at the 100 days coming up for the second Ursula von der Leyen Commission. We've got the new College of Commissioners. President von der Leyen has said she wants to have a competitiveness compass. She wants to really look at how Europe can be more competitive. So just in terms of innovation, do either of you see the need for either a legislative review of one of these things or some sort of executive action by the Commission? What specific things can happen in Brussels to make this go forward? Fiona?
I think it's quite hard to legislate on innovation, so I will let others take up that. I think the size of the market, once again, is a really critical element. If you can actually sell your great product or service to hundreds of millions of people, that's the best incentive. And if every time you want to sell into another member state, there's a whole pile of forms and regulators that want you to change your product, you're just not going to do it. And that hinders startups. So I think deepening the single market is the most useful thing that Europe could do.
We've also seen that EU companies like Mistral out of France are merging or doing joint ventures with some of the American companies, either to get access to cloud services or other things like that. Fiona, do you see any competition issues there with transatlantic ventures? Do you think that needs to be encouraged? It's going okay. It could go better.
I think the competition authorities are quite attentive to problems in AI and cloud and are watching those combinations very carefully in ways that we on the outside can't see. So I'm not going to be too worried about them right at the present minute. I would say that if those joint ventures are happening because the European startup feels it can't get to scale by itself in Europe, that's a sign that deepening the single market would be really helpful.
Thanks. Ara?
Yeah, from my side, I think, first of all, the Commission needs to be ready to withdraw some of the proposals that are out there, like AI Liability Act, because I don't think that or directive, because I think we need to first see the enforcement of AI Act, see some regulation that it's not going anywhere. And the last proposal by the Hungarian presidency was super worrying when it comes to privacy. And with these kind of proposals, we are not protecting children at all. Standard essential patents, good bad example of trying to fix something in the market that it's not broken. So we have many regulations, that proposals there that we could actually now withdraw. Because what we need right now is that we need to actually deregulate to make this market work and make sure that single market is not only in our big political speeches, but also in action. We need more risk capital. We need to have, let's say, quickly plus 30 million to more riskier projects in the EU, and this is not happening right now. So I'd say that Capital Markets Union, we need to bury it or then make it actually happen. And when I'm saying actually happen, we need to talk about big elephants in the room, like insolvency law or opening pension funds financing or harmonizing taxation in the EU. So if we are not ready to talk about those things, then I think we need to stop talking about the Capital Markets Union. So it depends what we actually want. We need this political will to now make this single market actually happen. We need this one entry point to our companies to enter to this market and make it easier for them to access the whole market area like quickly and with one entry point. So 28 regime, I'm looking forward to that, of course. And then we need to attract talent, because I'm worried about our brain drain from the EU, and also that we are not attracting talent from outside of the EU enough. What worries me is this Digital Fairness Act and what they will bake in. I hope that there will not be any more restrictions when it comes to data or data privacy. I hope that FairShare is not popping up again with a new name. We have had that since Reading Times, and I think we need to be ready to give it finally up. On metaverse, I hope that the Commission is finally starting to speak about one metaverse and not metaverses, like Breton was speaking, and understanding that this will be Internet 2.0 and Europe needs to be in this game. It worries me that Silicon Valley is already leading this, and if Europe can ever be in this game. So on Digital Fairness Act, I hope that it will be a deregulatory act, I would rather say. I know that the Commission is not wired the way that, they would withdraw something, but I hope that they have learned their lesson that this doesn't work. Europe is not competitive, and we need to enable much more during this new mandate.
Thank you so much for that. Just to help listeners keep up, FairShare was the proposal from Big Telecom that the technology companies who stream over fiber optic lines and things like that should help pay for installing them, should pay for the work of the telecoms providers. It was somewhat controversial. And then a 28th regime, I'm glad you brought that up too, because it's really interesting in the context of capital markets. It's the idea that there could be single supervision for certain types of activities, and that big companies could opt into EU supervision and out of national level supervision. The EU has used this in a few very specific areas, usually in very specific legal ways. So making something in finance world would be a big step forward, but it is an idea that's gaining ground. Alma, do you think the Parliament can help overcome the resistance in the member states?
I think so, because I can see that there is a political will now, and companies are really pushing this. This EU Inc. Also, they are making a huge movement now. I was in SLUS in Helsinki last week, and businesses are really now into this idea that we need to make this happen. And they are normally not so into EU affairs, but now they see this opportunity that we need to create this kind of a delivery model that in the US they have in the EU. So I hope that there is now more voice coming from the Parliament, and that's why I'm here today, also creating that important noise to make this happen.
I think it's a great idea, except for the name. I have to say, 28th regime does not work for me, because the number of member states in Europe, at least in my lifetime, keeps moving around. And so I would be inclined, unless you want to skip 28, like sometimes elevators do in buildings, I'd be inclined to call it the 0th regime, because that's safer. You can always have a 0th regime no matter how many member states there are in Europe. So I think that's the piece that I would change. But otherwise, I thoroughly agree. I think this would be just an enormous change for corporations. I think it would be dramatic.
I wonder if we can do that without changing the treaty. Will the Econ Committee be doing more own initiative reports in this area, do you think?
Well, I hope that we would focus much more on actual files and excellent reports than own initiatives from the Parliament. I myself like to focus on things that actually make a change. But of course, with own initiatives, you can get your points out there and create, of course, communication and noise. But from myself, I hope that I could focus on hardcore legislation rather than making my own initiatives.
So speaking of communication and noise, we saw from the election in Romania that tech companies and the voices they choose to platform and the money that flows through them can have big effects on the outcome of these things. What can Europe do about propaganda and hate speech while also leaving the marketplace to provide the types of communication and talking that either people want or that the large pockets of money that own these companies want to put out on the world?
I mean, the DSA is supposed to be helping with the danger posed by platforms. The DSA requires any large platform, to study itself and figure out the harms it's causing and remediate those harms and report about what it's doing. I think what we see in a situation like the Romanian election is that this is too slow. That if you're going to have this sort of responsibility, there probably needs to be a feeder pipe with certain data that just flows in to the commission in an automatic way from everybody big. And then instead of starting an action, requiring some testimony, asking for some data, studying the data, it's just the data's already there. And somebody can turn around and look at it and say, you were violating the law. You were supposed to be remediating this harm and you didn't. And so we're going to fine you or shut you down or whatever the relevant punishment is. I think waiting for a compliance process that takes years is going to render the law effective at only things that are long term, like what kinds of responses and likes affect teenagers' mental health. That could be something that you want to study over the long term and definitely should remediate and work on, but it's not going to be effective at incidents like sudden changes in that affect an election.
Yeah, I agree there. And again, this is one piece of legislation that companies who already have this business incentive to keep their platforms clean, they comply. But then if you're looking at X or TikTok, they don't comply. So it doesn't work in practice. I would like to make one important point here is that we have been passing the US companies for a decade from Brussels. And we had a really hard privacy shield negotiations a couple of years back after Schrems 1 and 2. And we finally found this solution with redress mechanism and so on. So we all agree that when we move data from the EU to US, that we need to know where our data goes there. At the same time, we have not been worried about China or where does our data go when we feed it to Huawei or TikTok. That's been completely fine with Schrems also. That surprises me. So I would say that I would ban TikTok in the EU when they are not compliant by our law. And the second thing is that we have been talking about strategic autonomy in the EU, but at the same time, we are basically feeding our data to the Chinese Communist Party, and it's helpful for them to develop their propaganda machine, because the Chinese law is super clear. They can request data from Chinese companies, and 20% of TikTok is owned by China or Chinese, and 20% is owned by their employees, and many of them are Chinese. So they are compliant by the Chinese law. Why aren't we worried about this if we are so worried about the US companies? And at the same time, we are begging to have weapons from the US to Ukraine and save us. And then we are pushing these companies. And then at the same time, we feed this literally gold, I'm calling here data gold, to China. So this is hypocritical, I would say, from the EU. And that's why I've been speaking on behalf of banning TikTok, because it is a strategic threat to the EU. Look at what China is helping Putin. Is this something that we want to feed gold to this machine that is helping Putin to kill Ukrainians in Ukraine? So we need to address this topic now the right way and make sure that Europeans understand what they are feeding to TikTok is gold to this Chinese Communist Party.
Such important issues, and highlights that policy in the EU is sometimes made by courts as well as by regulators. The Schrems case, for those of you who don't remember it, was the case filed by an Austrian citizen against the US-EU Safe Harbor Act. So it was specifically about transatlantic data. Fiona would very much welcome your contribution on this. And then at some point, I'll pre-ask my follow-up now. I'd like your thoughts on if the U.S. succeeds in forcing Google to separate out its browser, or Alphabet to do that with Google and Chrome, what that could mean, and if that could come back to Europe in some way.
Sure. Let me just say that I think that being nice to U.S. tech companies in order to get the United States to pay for arms to Ukraine is not really a sensible flow, in the sense that those people do different things in the United States government and are not aligned on the same page at all, unless you're talking about corruption, unless you say, look, Elon Musk will give you some special waivers in Europe if you lobby the Trump administration on Ukraine. That's beyond my expertise.
Let me be very clear. I'm not saying that we need to be nice to the US companies. I'm saying that we shouldn't be nice to Chinese companies. That was my point. I fully agree that we can be as hard as we want to the US companies, but then we need to be also hard on Chinese companies. That was my point.
Yep, I agree with that. So separating out the browser and the other remedies in the US, let me first say that we are in the United States regulating, yes, our own firms, but there in no sense do people in government have some magic power that they understand technology. I mean, I think this idea that we can't regulate for things that we aren't good at is a bit off the mark, in the sense that there is no government bureaucrat who's good at building a car. They're government bureaucrats, and likewise, they don't code. And the same is true in the United States. We regulate cars, we regulate computer platforms, and the people who do that don't either build cars or code. Europe regulates molasses and diamonds and doesn't produce them, and is bad at producing them. So this is not really the way we think about it. So the question is, can the government in the United States get help from market participants and experts and the company itself and documents and all the mountain of evidence produced in the trial to do something useful that would make more competition in browsers and search engines and entry into search, which maybe a browser would facilitate. And what the government laid out in its request is really a smorgasbord of options, some of which are duplicative because you don't know what the court is going to find attractive or think is consistent with the evidentiary record, and feasible. But what you really see is that whether or not there are divestitures, the court is going to be in the business of regulating for a very long time, because there's lots and lots of things that competition in search requires Google to change, that Google obviously doesn't want to change. If they wanted to, they would be doing it already. They prefer to do it the way they were doing it. And therefore, the court is going to have to force them to do it a different way. And that means there's going to be a technical committee that is to try to oversee what Google's doing, and a court that everyone can complain to, the company included, if the technical committee does something the company doesn't like, which is going to happen every day. And so it's going to be a many-year process with a court supervising all the behavioral changes that we want the firm to make. And this is why sometimes it's just cleaner and easier, including for the corporation, to spin something out. Instead of having a judge tell you how to run your business, here's an example of somebody who doesn't know how to code or run a business and isn't good at digital platforms. That person is a judge. Of course they're not. But that person might be running the details of that business on a week-to-week basis if there's disagreement between the technical committee and Google might at some point say, look, let's just sell this, and then we don't have to deal with this problem of running it, and we can get back to doing what we're good at, which is making our search engine excellent or whatever it might be. So there is that element. I think in Europe, a lot of people think of divestitures as some awful punishment. And that's not how it's thought of in the United States. It's just a question of, if you want these behavioral changes, is it easier to get them by having ongoing supervision for years and years? Or is it easier to get them by having the company just spin it out so different people are running it and they have different incentives? And one is not worse than the other in the punishment sense, but you want to pick the one that's more effective for the problem you're trying to fix. We'll see. I think there's a lot of unknowns and there'll be a lot of appeals. before we get any resolution in the U.S.
So we're coming to the end of this podcast. Would love to get some closing thoughts from each of you on where to start. There are just so many things to think about and things to start doing. As we head into 2025, what would be your top 1 or 2 areas where you'd like to see some action happen?
I would like to see the DMA actually be enforced. I would like to see Apple be required to comply with very basic provisions of the DMA that they are just simply not in compliance with right now. And there are some other companies that I won't focus on because the podcast is short, that are also not complying. And that is a major issue for rule of law. If you're going to pass a law and have a law and enforce the law, companies have to comply with the law. Otherwise, laws in Europe aren't laws. They're suggestions. And the democratic process of elect a parliament, have them do something that's supposed to protect citizens and protect businesses and encourage innovation, doesn't have its intended effect. And that's a big problem. That creates the reaction that we see today, even in this podcast, of this law wasn't worth it. We shouldn't have it at all.
That's the EU's Digital Markets Act, and you can find much written about that on the Bruegel website. Aura.
I want to see concrete action from the Commission that they will withdraw some of the proposed digital regulations, like standard essential patents or AI liability directive or CSAM to start with. I don't want to see new proposals coming from the Commission. I want them to actually now focus on deregulation, harmonization, and also that we would speed up our licensing processes, particularly what comes to the food sector. I'm looking forward to having, how would I say, better working Trade and Technology Council this term, because last term, the whole idea that we will not talk about the real stuff, like we didn't talk about the DMA or DSA or data flows, nothing that actually matters in the digital world. So now I hope that we will actually address concrete issues in the Tech and Technology Council. And my bigger narrative is that let's do bigger mergers. Let's enable these European companies to actually grow the big if we want that. And let's stop talking about these things and let's make things actually happen.
Thank you. The Trade and Technology Council, of course, the US-EU trade vehicle of the moment, since there are not any proposed trade agreements or trade deals in the works beyond this ongoing coordination. Thanks both of you for this great conversation. So many ideas, so many things going on, but I hope listeners got a flavor for the debate in Brussels and a lot of ideas for what to learn about and where to read. I look forward to seeing both of you in the policy space, helping make the EU's regulations and rules and laws better. And I thank you so much for coming on our podcast. This has been The Sound of Economics from Bruegel. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie. I'm a senior fellow here at Bruegel, joined by Fiona Scott Morton, also a senior fellow among her many other accomplishments and titles, and Aura Sala, member of the European Parliament coming from Finland. Thank you both. Everyone else, thank you for listening, and everyone have a great day.